Hello, friends, and welcome to another week of Pastor's Ponderings. It's wonderful to be back together again this week as we continue working our way through the parts of the Lutheran Liturgy. We began last week looking at the invocation, where we invoke the name of the triune God, in whose name we gather as a Christian people each and every Sunday. Today we continue on in our liturgical journey, and we take some time to pause and to look at a central and an unbelievably important part of our worship together. Today we pause and we look at confession and absolution. Throughout the ages, Christians have often earned for themselves the reputation of being far better at seeing the flaws in other people than the flaws in our own selves. Unfortunately, it has been an earned reputation, and it's been something that Christians, no matter the generation, have had to work on and contend with. But that trouble, that struggle, makes confession and absolution all the more a beautiful and necessary aspect of our worship here together. For as we come together for the rite of confession and absolution, we gather around the sacrament that calls us to pause and to take a moment to focus not on the sin of anybody else in the room, but on the brokenness and the frailty within myself. At first glance, it doesn't really seem all that enticing to come to church only to be forced to recognize the frailty and the brokenness in myself. It's not the most exciting or appealing idea to have to openly acknowledge that my life falls far short of where God calls me to be. And yet to pause and to think about the placement of confession and absolution in the Lutheran liturgy ultimately helps me to come to the realization that as uncomfortable as confession may be for a moment, in the long run, it is actually a sacrament that gives me an incredible gift. It unburdens me and it sets me free to move into worship of the God who has been so good and so wonderful to me. The sacrament of confession and absolution ultimately is something that's been instituted by Christ himself. It goes all the way back to the book of Matthew, where Jesus is talking to Peter and he says, "Peter, you are the rock, on you I'll build my church. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The way that the church has understood this throughout the ages is that Jesus is there giving Peter the authority to bind and loose sin, to, on the authority of God, look at people and say, "I know that you're torn up about that brokenness you recognize in your life, but I, with the authority of God, am telling you that God forgives you." Or if it's somebody who wants to wallow in certain sin and refuses to recognize it and just wants to persist no matter what, Peter also has the authority to say, "I am not going to announce the forgiveness of God to you. You need to realize the seriousness of that brokenness." Now the latter is something that is used hardly ever in the church, but the former, the loosing of sin, is something that is a privilege that is passed down through the leadership of the church. And so as pastors, when we open our mouth at the end of confession and absolution, and we say that as a called and ordained minister of the Church of Christ, and by his authority, I declare unto you the entire forgiveness of all of your sin, what you're hearing at that point is not the words of Pastor David or Pastor Short assuring you that you're forgiven. What you're hearing from our mouth are the words of God saying that you are absolutely and without a doubt forgiven of your sin. And so the rite of confession and absolution, as uncomfortably as it begins when we have to realize that we fall short of what God calls us to be, not those other people, but me, myself, I fall short of where God calls me to be, that ultimately leads me to hearing the most incredible forgiveness from a God who recognizes that I fall short and still says, "I love you and I forgive you. Now let's worship together." And so this rite of confession and absolution, it's not the most comfortable thing. Certainly in our society, we get really defensive the moment that anybody suggests there's something wrong with me. But for a Christian to refuse to participate in the rite of confession is ultimately to commit a great robbery towards themselves. Because if I refuse to admit that I'm broken, then I also make myself unable to hear that even though I'm broken, God still loves me, and God forgives me, and God wishes me well. And he invites me into a worship that's going to culminate in me holding his flesh and blood in my hands and taking him into myself. And so the sacrament of confession and absolution It is so unpopular in some ways, and yet it is such an incredible gift that we should do everything we possibly can to be a part of, because at the end of the day, we move through that discomfort and into liberation and freedom and life and forgiveness and the knowledge that we are God's children and we don't have to be perfect to be called his children. So now that we have moved through the sacrament of confession and absolution, we have been able to place our baggage at the door, and we are ready for worship to officially begin. And so I thank you for spending some time with me as we've looked at the first beginnings of the Lutheran liturgy, and I am excited to spend some more time in the weeks ahead looking at what follows and all of the riches and vibrancy that's a part of every aspect of the worship that we enjoy as a Christian people together. God bless you, dear friends, and I can't wait to talk to you again soon.